Emma's small hands clutched her worn teddy bear tightly, her fingers gripping the plush fabric with a strength that belied her 3 years. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of her family's living room, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Outside, the suburban neighborhood buzzed quietly with unease. Sirens wailed in the distance, echoing off the neat rows of houses lined with freshly mown lawns. From her spot on the couch, Emma watched the world with wide, observant eyes, her tiny mind cataloging every sound, movement, and expression around her. Something had changed in the air today, though she didn't know exactly what. Her parents, Mark and Lily, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. Mark hummed softly as he fixed Emma's breakfast, flipping pancakes on the stove with a practiced hand. Lily sat nearby, sipping coffee, her gaze occasionally darting toward the window, toward the flashing lights that painted the driveway in red and blue hues. Both parents felt the subtle tension in the neighborhood. News of a burglary had spread through the local community like wildfire. But in front of Emma, they spoke in calm, measured tones, hiding the worry in their hearts. They wanted her to feel safe. To Emma, though, the world was already filled with mysteries she instinctively noticed, and the flicker of concern in her parents' eyes was not lost on her. Emma's teddy bear had a slightly frayed ear, a button eye that had loosened over time, and a stitched smile that had faded from years of hugging. She held it close, as if it were a shield from the unseen dangers that adults whispered about outside. Yet, even with her shield, Emma's curiosity could not be contained. The hum of police radios reached her tiny ears through the open window, blending with the distant shouts of officers and the occasional bark of neighborhood dogs. She tilted her head, listening intently, absorbing the rhythm of the world around her. The patterns that would go unnoticed by anyone else, the quick, almost imperceptible glances of the officers, the way their shoes scuffed against the concrete, the almost hidden movement near a parked vehicle. These were all registered by her sharp, untrained eyes. "Emma, pancakes are ready," her father called gently, trying to ground her in the normalcy of breakfast. She nodded absent-mindedly, still gazing toward the window. Her tiny mind buzzed with questions she could not yet articulate. Why were the police here? Why did the neighbors whisper behind closed curtains? Her mother, picking up on Emma's distracted expression, placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. "It's okay, sweetie," she said softly. "Everything is fine. Just eat your breakfast." But Emma's attention remained fixed outside. She noticed things she had no words for, yet patterns of behavior, fleeting expressions of concern, and the almost imperceptible tension that seemed to hang in the air like static. The neighborhood was quiet now in appearance, but the subtle signs of alarm were everywhere. A police van idled at the corner, its engine humming softly. Officers moved with careful precision, carrying clipboards, radios, and evidence bags. Their eyes scanned every detail, from the cracked sidewalk to the neatly trimmed hedges, searching for clues that might solve the mystery of the recent crime. Emma, perched on her chair, noticed it all. The way one officer's shoes were slightly scuffed, how another kept adjusting his gloves, the subtle nods exchanged between them. She tilted her head, absorbing it all, her imagination beginning to weave connections that adults would later dismiss as improbable for someone so young. Her mother tried again to pull her attention back to breakfast. "Eat your pancakes, Emma," Lily urged, cutting a small piece for her daughter. But Emma barely touched it. Her gaze remained outside, following a police officer as he crouched near the mailbox of a house 2 doors down. Something about the man's movements caught her attention, and she whispered to herself, "Why?" As if the world might answer. Her parents exchanged a quiet glance, sensing her unusual focus. Emma had always been perceptive for her age, but today there was a sharpness in her attention that neither parent had seen before. She noticed patterns, gaps, and inconsistencies, tiny details that adults overlooked, the The sound of the sirens faded slightly, replaced by the low murmur of officers' voices. Emma's tiny fingers twitched as she held her teddy bear, her curiosity growing into something more defined. She could sense that something important was happening, though she did not yet understand the gravity of the situation. She tugged on her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Look, look." Lily looked down, a mixture of amusement and mild concern on her face. "What is it, sweetie?" she asked, trying to appear calm. Emma's eyes followed the movement of the officers as one approached a parked vehicle, bending down to inspect something that Emma could not fully see. But in her mind, the pieces of a puzzle were beginning to form, invisible to the adult eye. Mark, noticing his daughter's unwavering attention, set down his spatula and came over. "Emma, honey, it's okay," he said gently. "The police are just doing their job." But Emma's attention did not waver. She watched as one officer signaled to another, a small wave of the hand that seemed insignificant to everyone but her. The way the officers interacted, the subtle hesitation, the quick glances exchanged, it all registered in her mind. She whispered again, more to herself than anyone else, "Not right. Not right." Her parents frowned, unsure what to make of her words. To them, it was a child's confusion, but to Emma, it was a recognition of truth hidden beneath appearances. The front door creaked open, and Emma's neighbor, Mrs. Harris, peeked out briefly, whispering, "Did you hear about the burglary?" Her words were hurried, cautious. Emma's eyes flicked toward Mrs. Harris, then back to the police officers outside. Every movement, every sound, every expression was catalogued in her mind. The officers lifted a small bag from the ground, examined its contents, and discussed quietly. Emma tilted her head, noticing the discrepancies, the tiny hints that told a story adults would not yet understand. Her teddy bear hugged tightly to her chest. She felt an urge to communicate what she had noticed, though words eluded her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours for Emma. Her small heart pounded with anticipation and a strange, unspoken understanding. The officers moved in ways that told her something significant was unfolding. She whispered again, "Not him," though this time she directed it toward the police dog that had appeared on the scene. The dog, large and alert, sniffed the air and surveyed the surroundings with an intensity that mirrored Emma's own observation. It was a moment unnoticed by adults, but Emma's intuition, sharpened by innocent curiosity, had already made a silent connection. She understood, in her own way, that the truth was within reach, and her tiny voice might one day make it known. By the time breakfast was half finished, the officers had begun to gather evidence more deliberately. Emma's parents tried to engage her, offering more pancakes, attempting to redirect her attention, but her eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene. Every subtle motion, every exchanged glance between the officers, every sniff and movement of the police dog, all of it registered in Emma's perceptive mind. She did not yet understand the full implications, but instinctively, she knew something important was happening. In her quiet, observant way, Emma had already begun a journey that would soon change the course of events for everyone around her, including the adults who underestimated the clarity of a child's gaze. As the morning sun climbed higher, Emma continued to watch, noticing minute details adults overlooked. A folded piece of paper partially hidden near a fence, the way the dog tilted its head at certain movements, the subtle hesitation of officers handling evidence. She whispered occasionally to her teddy, pointing, tugging at her mother's sleeve, and murmuring small observations. Her parents exchanged worried glances, unsure whether to take her seriously or dismiss her words as childish rambling. But Emma's sharp eyes missed nothing. In the quiet morning, she became a silent witness, her awareness stretching far beyond her 3 years, unknowingly setting the stage for the courtroom drama that would follow. The courthouse loomed tall and imposing, its marble steps gleaming under the mid-morning sun. Emma's small hand slipped into her mother's as they ascended, her teddy tucked under her arm like a loyal companion. The massive wooden doors swung open with a low groan, revealing a world both familiar and intimidating. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood, paper, and anticipation, thick with the invisible weight of authority. Lawyers in sharp suits whispered hurriedly, adjusting ties and skirts, their eyes darting to the jury box. Reporters jostled with notepads ready, cameras poised to capture every fleeting expression. Emma's gaze swept the room, her wide eyes taking in details no adult would notice. Her father, Mark, held her close as they approached the gallery. "Stay close, Emma," he murmured, his voice calm but tinged with tension. Lily squeezed her daughter's hand, offering a reassuring smile. They had explained, in simple terms, that they were going to a place where adults talked about right and wrong. Yet, Emma understood little of that. Her mind, however, absorbed everything around her: the shuffling papers, the murmur of conversations, the soft tap of shoes against polished floors. Her tiny fingers clutched the edge of the pew as her mother guided her toward a seat. The courtroom seemed enormous, each detail magnified in her eyes: the polished bench, the heavy chandelier, the serious faces of the people gathered in the center. The judge sat elevated on a platform, robes draping in perfect folds, gavel resting at the ready. He scanned the room with measured authority, his expression unreadable, though his eyes flicked briefly toward the family entering. Emma, sensing his scrutiny, shifted slightly, her eyes briefly meeting his, before darting toward the figures surrounding him. Across the room, the defendant fidgeted in his chair, nervously wringing his hands. Lawyers whispered urgently, exchanging papers and notes, their faces tight with concern. In the corner, a police dog sat alert, ears perked and nose twitching as if sensing the tension in the room. The dog's presence, usually secondary to the legal proceedings, seemed to radiate an air of anticipation. Emma's attention immediately settled on the police dog. Her tiny head tilted to the side as she studied the animal, noting every movement: the slight twitch of its tail, the way it sniffed the air, the precise coordination of its handler's commands. To Emma, the dog was more than a trained animal. It was a sentinel, a participant in the unfolding drama, and perhaps a keeper of the hidden truth. She whispered to her teddy, "Watch, watch," her voice barely audible. Lily knelt beside her, unsure whether to encourage or distract her daughter, fearing that Emma's heightened focus might be disruptive in a place so serious. The lawyers rose, signaling the start of proceedings. The prosecutor began with a measured tone, reciting the details of the crime: the burglary, the suspect's alleged movements, the evidence collected. Witnesses were called to recount their experiences, describing fragmented observations and inconsistent timelines. Emma's ears perked at every word. Her mind, unlike most adults, did not filter out the minor details. She noticed the slight hesitation when one witness mentioned the suspect's appearance, the nervous glance exchanged between two officers, the slight tremor in the defendant's voice. Her small hands clutched the edge of the bench, her body leaning forward, as if she could absorb every nuance through sheer concentration. The defense attorney, a woman with sharp eyes and a confident demeanor, rose to counter the accusations. She spoke quickly, emphasizing discrepancies in the evidence, questioning witness reliability, and subtly highlighting the uncertainty in the prosecution's case. Emma's gaze flicked between the lawyers, noting the precise timing of their gestures, the rhythm of their speech, and the subtle cues they gave each other. To the adults, these were ordinary courtroom behaviors. To Emma, they were hints, puzzle pieces fitting together in a picture only she could begin to see. She whispered again to her teddy, "Something's wrong," her voice small but insistent. The judge paused briefly, reviewing notes, glancing toward the jury. Emma, observing the pattern, noticed the judge's raised eyebrow when a witness faltered, the slight nod when another confirmed a timeline. She was learning, instinctively, the language of observation, the dance of attention and reaction that adults relied upon in judgment. In the corner, the police dog shifted, sniffing at the carpet near the defense table, ears flicking toward an object barely noticeable to anyone else. Emma's eyes widened. The connection was instant, a spark of understanding forming in her young mind. Something important was unfolding, and she knew, with the certainty of childhood instinct, that the dog's presence was key. Mark and Lily exchanged worried glances. Emma had always been sharp, but the intensity of her focus today was different. "Emma, honey, behave," her mother whispered, her voice a mixture of affection and concern. But Emma barely heard her. Her eyes tracked the officers, the dog, and the subtle movements of the defendant. She noticed the slight shift in the man's posture whenever the dog turned, the flicker of uncertainty in the officer's eyes, and the subtle hesitation of the witness when asked to confirm details. Her tiny mind catalogued everything with precision. Though she lacked the words to explain it, time passed slowly. Witnesses continued their testimony. Lawyers cross-examined with meticulous care, and the jury absorbed every detail. Emma, perched on her mother's lap, whispered occasional observations to her teddy. "Not him," she murmured, a phrase that would later shock the courtroom. Her words, simple and unassuming, were dismissed by adults as the ramblings of a child. Yet, within them lay the seeds of clarity that no one else had seen. Emma's attention, combined with the presence of the police dog, had formed a silent narrative, one that traced movements, hesitations, and hidden truths with astonishing accuracy. The court reporter tapped steadily at her typewriter, recording every word, while Emma's tiny mind recorded far more than she could articulate. She noticed the rhythm of the trial, the inconsistencies in statements, the micro-expressions on faces, and the subtle cues from the police dog. The gallery murmured occasionally, unaware that a 3-year-old was absorbing the trial's essence more accurately than many seasoned professionals. Emma's focus was unwavering. Every twitch of the dog's ears, every glance between the defendant and his attorney, every minor pause in testimony, all contributed to a picture that she alone could perceive. Suddenly, as a witness described the alleged actions of the suspect, Emma's finger twitched. She pointed toward the police dog, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to catch her mother's attention. Not him. The courtroom, engrossed in legal formalities, momentarily froze. Mark and Lily exchanged panicked glances, unsure whether to intervene. The judge's eyes narrowed. Lawyers paused mid-sentence, and the defendant blinked in confusion. The words of a toddler had cut through the structured proceedings, hinting at a revelation that adults had overlooked. Emma's small voice, though tiny in volume, carried the weight of insight that no one expected. As the judge called for a brief recess, murmurs filled the room. Lawyers conferred quietly, officers whispered to one another, and reporters jotted notes furiously. The courtroom had shifted subtly, the focus now partially on a small child whose innocence and perception had introduced doubt into a carefully constructed narrative. Emma sat quietly, hugging her teddy bear, unaware of the chaos she had sparked. The police dog, calm but alert, seemed almost to acknowledge her observation with a tilt of its head. In that moment, the stage was set for the extraordinary events that would follow, all hinging on the awareness and intuition of a 3-year-old. The courtroom hummed with tension, a low murmur of voices blending with the occasional shuffle of papers and the quiet tapping of shoes on polished floors. Witness after witness recounted the events surrounding the burglary, each offering details filtered through memory and bias. Adults debated inconsistencies, timelines, and evidence, trying to untangle the web of truth. Emma, perched on her mother's lap, absorbed every word, every gesture, and every fleeting expression. Her 3-year-old mind processed patterns that seemed invisible to the seasoned professionals around her. The angles, the pauses, the micro-expressions, she noticed them all, though she lacked the language to explain them fully. As a witness described the alleged movements of the suspect near the crime scene. Emma's tiny fingers twitched with growing urgency. She leaned closer to her mother, whispering, "Not him." Lily's heart skipped. She looked down at her daughter, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Emma, honey, what did you say?" she asked softly, careful not to draw attention. Emma's eyes were wide and unblinking, focused on the police dog sitting near the prosecution's table. "Not him," she repeated, her voice firmer this time, and pointed directly at the dog. The words hung in the air like an unexpected storm cloud. Unseen but undeniable, the courtroom seemed to pause, as if sensing the intrusion of a child's intuition into a world of rigid procedures. The judge raised an eyebrow, papers momentarily forgotten in his hands. The lawyers exchanged rapid, confused glances, unsure how to respond to what was, at first glance, the ramblings of a toddler. But there was something undeniable in Emma's gaze, an intensity that refused to be ignored. Even the police officers shifted in their seats, glancing toward the dog and back at the child. Emma's 2 words had pierced the fabric of certainty that had cloaked the proceedings, leaving a subtle but palpable ripple of doubt. Mark and Lily exchanged nervous, bewildered looks. Their daughter, so small and seemingly powerless, had spoken with clarity beyond her years. Mark's hand rested protectively on Emma's shoulder. "She doesn't understand what's happening," he whispered, attempting to rationalize her statement, though his own mind wavered. Lily squeezed his arm, her thoughts racing. Emma's observation, dismissed at first as innocent babbling, might actually hold meaning. The police dog handler, now alert, subtly adjusted his stance, eyes narrowing. The dog, trained to detect traces of truth hidden to human senses, seemed almost to acknowledge the tiny witness's observation with a soft shift of its head. The prosecutor, a tall woman with sharp features, took a deep breath and attempted to regain control. "Your Honor, this is a child's comment. It's irrelevant," she said, voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. The defense attorney, a quick-witted man with a keen sense for opportunity, leaned forward, voice low but deliberate. "Perhaps, Your Honor, even the smallest observations can carry weight. We might consider whether this child noticed something adults missed." A hush fell over the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing a developing human interest story. Cameras discreetly pivoted toward the young girl, whose 2 words were now at the center of growing intrigue. Emma, oblivious to the legal weight her words carried, returned her attention to the police dog. She noticed the subtle way it tilted its head, sniffed the floor, and adjusted its posture in response to movements adults barely registered. To her, it was clear that the dog was reacting to something, but not the suspect everyone assumed. Her small mind connected the dots, weaving together observations from her brief walks near the scene, the sudden appearance of officers, and the patterns in their behavior. Something in the room, something everyone overlooked, had already been registered by her intuitive perception. Emma's instinctive clarity was about to shift the courtroom's trajectory forever. The judge, after a brief pause, called for a recess to allow counsel to consult privately. Lawyers and officers filed quietly out of the main room, murmuring and gesturing. Inside the hushed courtroom, Emma remained seated, clutching her teddy bear tightly. Her mother whispered reassurances, though her voice was shaky. "Sweetie, you were very brave," Lily said, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's forehead. Emma's fingers tightened around the bear, not fully comprehending her actions, but feeling the significance of the attention around her. She had pointed, spoken 2 words, and unknowingly disrupted the adult order of assumptions. During the recess, detectives quietly huddled near the evidence tables, reviewing photographs, witness statements, and the timeline of events. Each detail, previously interpreted one way, was now reconsidered under the lens of Emma's observation. Could a 3-year-old truly perceive something that seasoned investigators had missed? The head detective, a man with decades of experience, murmured to his partner, "Her instincts. Maybe she noticed what we overlooked." Outside the courtroom, media crews whispered about the child who might have changed a legal battle's trajectory. Emma, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of her growing fame and influence, focusing instead on the dog and the quiet details adults ignored. Returning from recess, the courtroom resumed with heightened tension. Witnesses were recalled, evidence revisited, and lawyers approached every statement with renewed scrutiny. Emma watched, her gaze fixed on the interactions between the dog, its handler, and the defendant. Her small hand twitched, pointing subtly, as if signaling to the adults what they were failing to see. "Not him," she murmured once more, quietly but with unmistakable certainty. The judge's eyes narrowed. Something in the courtroom atmosphere had changed. A tiny child, previously peripheral, now commanded the unspoken attention of everyone present. The defense attorney saw an opportunity. Leaning slightly toward the judge, he suggested, "Your Honor, perhaps this child's observations warrant consideration. Children notice things adults miss, and it could be crucial to understanding the full context of the case." The judge, intrigued despite himself, paused, considering the unusual proposal. The courtroom, normally disciplined and procedural, hummed with quiet anticipation. Reporters leaned forward, officers exchanged glances, and the police dog shifted, as if aware that a silent verdict of observation had already been cast. Emma, focused and innocent, remained unaware that she had become the pivot of a legal drama far beyond her comprehension. Emma's observations began to ripple through the room like invisible threads, connecting evidence, witness behavior, and the dog's subtle responses. Adults recalibrated their focus, retracing prior assumptions, noticing inconsistencies that had previously gone unchallenged. Her tiny mind, absorbing cues that adults overlooked, had already identified a discrepancy in the accepted narrative. While lawyers argued, and witnesses repeated testimony, Emma silently cataloged every micro-expression, every twitch of the dog's ears, every hesitation or glance exchanged between humans. She had noticed patterns in movement, evidence placement, and behavior that would soon append the adult consensus, though she could only express it through 2 simple words, an appointed finger dot. By mid-morning, the courtroom's energy had shifted. Emma's words, initially dismissed, were now an undercurrent running through the legal proceedings. The police dog handler quietly reviewed the dog's behavior, comparing it to Emma's indication. Every officer who had once believed in the straightforward narrative now hesitated, re-examining assumptions. Emma, seated with her teddy bear, remained a silent observer, unaware of the monumental influence she had already wielded. The jury, sensing subtle tension among adults, leaned forward in curiosity, though unaware of the specifics. The simple act of a toddler pointing and saying, "Not him," had introduced doubt, and doubt was a powerful force in any trial. As proceedings continued, Emma whispered occasionally to herself and to her teddy, following the dog's movements and watching the defendant with focused intensity. She noticed that certain reactions did not align with the expected behavior of a guilty party. Subtle inconsistencies, overlooked by witnesses and adults, were recorded silently in her young mind. The courtroom, a place of structured dialogue and legal formalities, was now punctuated by the presence of a 3-year-old, whose instinctive observations threatened to reframe the narrative entirely. Emma's awareness, combined with her innocence, made her a uniquely impartial observer. She had begun her quiet, unprecedented role in a story that would soon captivate the community and legal world alike. By the end of the morning session, a strange stillness settled over the courtroom. Everyone sensed a shift, though no one could yet articulate its source. Emma's 2 words, repeated with unwavering certainty, had become a focal point of curiosity and doubt. Her parents, proud and anxious, whispered encouragement, careful not to disrupt the proceedings. The police dog remained alert, its posture almost mirroring Emma's focused intensity. And somewhere within the layers of observation, assumption, and procedure, the first threads of truth were beginning to reveal themselves. Threads that only a small, perceptive mind could see, and a tiny voice would soon make known. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as the morning proceedings drew to a close. Emma sat clutching her teddy bear, her small eyes tracking every subtle motion, the defendant shifting nervously, the officers exchanging brief, meaningful glances, and the police dog shifting slightly, alert but restrained. Though adults debated the credibility of witnesses and examined their papers obsessively, a silent ripple had already begun. Emma's 2 words, spoken softly yet clearly, "Not him," had introduced an invisible thread of doubt that wove its way through the room. The effect was almost imperceptible, yet it changed everything. Doc Mark and Lily whispered to each other, exchanging worried glances. Their daughter had never spoken with such certainty before, yet her conviction seemed unshakable. Could she really have noticed something? Lily asked quietly, her voice almost lost in the shuffle of papers and low murmurs. Mark shook his head, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Emma's words were simple, almost childlike, but in a courtroom where adults relied on evidence, testimony, and procedure, the notion that a 3-year-old's observation could influence the outcome seemed impossible. And yet, the way the police dog shifted subtly in response to her gesture suggested something more. Outside the courtroom, reporters whispered and jostled, sensing the potential for a story far beyond an ordinary burglary trial. Inside, the defense attorney approached the bench with measured steps, leaning slightly toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said in a low voice, "even the smallest observation can be critical. I suggest we consider this child's perspective seriously. Children notice details adults might overlook." The judge, a man accustomed to logic and procedure, furrowed his brow. He glanced toward Emma, who remained quiet, absorbed in watching the dog. There was something compelling in her focus, something that made even experienced adults pause and reconsider. The prosecutor, attempting to regain control of the room, spoke firmly. "Your Honor, this is a child's comment. It cannot be considered evidence. There's no way to know the intention behind it, and it carries no credibility." But even as she spoke, a subtle unease crept into her voice. The dog handler, experienced and meticulous, had already noted changes in the dog's behavior that aligned with Emma's pointing. The prosecution's confidence, once steady, now wavered in small but undeniable ways. Something they had assumed certain a narrative about the suspect was suddenly open to question. Detectives quietly gathered near the evidence tables, reviewing photographs and timelines. They cross-referenced witness statements, noting inconsistencies they had previously overlooked. Patterns emerged, details that had seemed inconsequential before now appearing significant. Emma's observation, simple as it was, had forced professionals to re-evaluate assumptions that had guided their investigation. One officer whispered to another, "Her instincts. She might have actually noticed what we missed." They exchanged skeptical glances, but the dog's subtle cues and the child's pointed gesture could not be ignored. The courtroom had been subtly transformed, and no one had yet fully realized the implications. Emma's tiny mind processed the information around her in ways adults could not. She noticed micro-expressions, the quick glance when a witness avoided eye contact, the slight hesitation in an officer's voice, the subtle shifting of the defendant's posture. Each observation added another thread to the narrative she'd begun constructing silently. To Emma, patterns were as obvious as lines on a page. The dog, moving slightly in response to these same cues, mirrored her perception. Though she could not articulate it in adult terms, the quiet tension she sensed was a result of truths hidden in plain sight, waiting to be revealed. That the judge called the room to order, though his tone was more deliberate than usual. "We will continue with testimony," he said, his eyes briefly resting on Emma. Lawyers adjusted their papers. Witnesses took hesitant breaths, and the defendant's shifting grew more pronounced. Yet, beneath the surface, the trial had shifted. Every observer officer, attorney, juror was now conscious of an element that had previously gone unnoticed. A child's perspective had disrupted their assumptions. Emma's presence, once peripheral, had become a subtle pivot point, influencing how adults interpreted the evidence and testimony. Lawyers conferred quietly, the defense subtly incorporating the possibility of overlooked observations into their strategy. The prosecution, meanwhile, re-examined each line of questioning, aware that the child's statement, though unorthodox, could no longer be dismissed entirely. Outside, the murmurs of reporters grew louder, their curiosity heightened by the presence of a perceptive toddler. Within the room, jurors leaned forward, unconsciously influenced by the unusual energy introduced by Emma's observation. Something in the air had changed. Certainty had fractured, replaced by cautious consideration and quiet doubt as new witnesses took the stand. Each statement was now interpreted through a lens subtly altered by Emma's insight. The officers quietly noted discrepancies, previously dismissed, and the dog's reactions were given new weight. Even the defendant, though unaware of the exact nature of the attention focused on him, seemed to sense the shift. Micro-expressions and almost imperceptible quiver of the lips, a fleeting avoidance of gaze, were noted by both professionals and the small observer. Emma, sitting quietly with her teddy, had unwittingly become an arbiter of subtle truths, her observations rippling through a system designed for adults alone. During a brief pause in proceedings, Mark leaned close to his daughter. "Emma, do you understand what's happening?" he asked softly. She shook her head, still focused on the dog, murmuring, "Something's not right." Lily's heart tightened. She had always known her daughter was perceptive, but today, that perception was extraordinary. Emma's focus, innocent and unwavering, had forced a room of adults to confront the limits of their understanding. The dog, now more alert than ever, seemed attuned to the child's cues, signaling with tiny movements that confirmed her observations. It was a quiet alliance of intuition and instinct, unnoticed by anyone but the keenest eyes. The courtroom resumed with a new energy. Every word from witnesses, every gesture from the lawyers, and every subtle cue from the dog was scrutinized more carefully. Emma's observation had created a ripple effect, tiny, almost imperceptible, but potent. Officers rechecked notes, lawyers cross-referenced statements, and the judge observed with a heightened sense of attention. Emma, still clinging to her teddy, seemed unaware of the growing weight of her influence. To her, it was simply a matter of noticing patterns, of following what her instincts whispered. But to the adults, the trial's trajectory had subtly shifted, and the implications were profound. By the end of the morning, the ripple of doubt had grown. Witness statements were questioned with greater precision, timelines were recalculated, and even minor inconsistencies were treated with newfound significance. Emma's small voice, whispered in the quietest moments, had introduced uncertainty into the narrative that adults had treated as fact. The defense saw opportunity, the prosecution felt unease, and the jury, though not fully aware of why, sensed a subtle shift in the balance of certainty. The courtroom, meticulously organized and procedural, had become a place where the perception of a 3-year-old quietly began to influence the course of justice. Emma, unaware of her growing impact, continued to observe. The dog shifted slightly, aligning with her line of sight, reinforcing the unspoken truth she had recognized. Adults adjusted, recalibrated, and reconsidered, prompted by cues only a child could perceive. The courtroom had entered a state of heightened awareness, a tension between established procedures and emerging, unanticipated insight. What had begun as a routine trial was transforming into a story where the sharp perception of a 3-year-old and the instincts of a police dog together began to unravel assumptions, long held as fact. By the time the morning session adjourned for lunch, murmurs of doubt had spread through the courtroom. Lawyers whispered to one another, officers exchanged subtle nods, and even the judge seemed to carry a thoughtful crease between his brows. Emma, still clutching her teddy, glanced at the dog and whispered, "See? See?" Her words were simple, almost naive, but their effect was profound. In the quiet of her innocence, she had sown the seeds of uncertainty that would challenge every assumption made in the case and set the stage for revelations that would shock the courtroom in the hours to come. The courtroom was quiet now, a temporary lull settling over the proceedings as the morning's unexpected disruptions left everyone unsettled. Emma remained seated on her mother's lap, clutching her teddy bear with quiet determination. Her small fingers had a subtle grip, one she had used countless times before when noticing details adults might miss. Today, though, those details mattered. Even the police officers, with years of training and countless investigations behind them, could not ignore the truth that Emma's innocent observation hinted at. Her 2 words, "not him," had begun a chain reaction that would alter the entire trajectory of the case. Detectives gathered in a corner of the courtroom during a brief recess, huddling near photographs, timelines, and physical evidence that had been collected in the initial investigation. Each piece of data, once considered straightforward and conclusive, was now reconsidered. A fingerprint here, a smudge there, a partially moved object. Minor inconsistencies that had previously seemed irrelevant now demanded attention. The officers whispered to each other in low tones, cross-referencing witness statements with the dog's behavior and Emma's simple, pointed observation. "It doesn't add up," one detective murmured. "We overlooked something in that child." She might have actually noticed it. Mark and Lily watched, tense and apprehensive, as the adults conferred. Their daughter, oblivious to the weight of her role, continued observing the courtroom with wide, perceptive eyes. Emma noticed subtle patterns in human behavior, a slight hesitation in a witness's response, the flicker of uncertainty in the defendant's eyes, the dog's micro-adjustments in stance as it sniffed near the evidence. These small, almost imperceptible cues formed a coherent pattern in her mind, though she could not yet explain it with words. Yet the adults, now reviewing the scene and testimonies with her observations in mind, began to see what she had quietly pointed out. The defense attorney, emboldened by the toddler's comments, suggested revisiting key pieces of evidence. "Your Honor," he said, leaning forward with deliberate calm, "perhaps the child's perspective offers insight we cannot ignore. We request permission to re-examine the physical evidence and witness accounts in light of her observations." The judge paused, brow furrowed, before nodding. "Proceed," he said, his tone measured but firm. Within moments, the courtroom transformed into a space of renewed scrutiny. Officers moved carefully, retrieving evidence, rechecking timelines, and consulting photographs. Even seasoned professionals sensed the shift in momentum, all triggered by a small, seemingly innocuous voice. Emma, still sitting on her mother's lap, leaned slightly forward. Her gaze remained fixed on the police dog, whose ears twitched as it sniffed near a partially opened evidence bag. Emma's tiny hand twitched in recognition, as if pointing out the connection adults had missed. "Not there," she whispered, pressing her lips together in concentration. Lily and Mark exchanged glances, a mix of awe and disbelief. How could their 3-year-old daughter, barely able to articulate complex ideas, perceive something that had eluded trained investigators? They said nothing, watching quietly. Knowing that this moment, small and silent, was pivotal, detectives and forensic experts moved methodically, reviewing the evidence with renewed intensity. They retested fingerprints, reanalyzed footprints, and re-examined the timeline of the burglary. Subtle contradictions emerged that had gone unnoticed in the initial assessment. One fingerprint, thought to belong to the defendant, had been partially smudged, misread, or overlooked. A scuff mark on the pavement didn't match the suspect's shoes. A window's latch was misaligned, suggesting entry from a different angle than initially believed. Each minor detail gained weight under the fresh scrutiny, and the courtroom atmosphere subtly shifted. Adults, guided by a combination of intuition and observation, were beginning to see the cracks in the original narrative. Emma's eyes darted between the defendant and the dog. She noticed the alignment of the evidence with subtle changes in posture and micro-expressions. To her, the pieces fit together in a pattern that adults were only beginning to comprehend. The dog, responding to faint scents and instinctive cues, seemed to reinforce what she had already recognized. The true sequence of events had been misread. Officers exchanged quiet words, confirming suspicions that the child had, in essence, illuminated the inconsistencies in their prior assumptions. Emma's innocent observation had become the linchpin for a re-evaluation that could not be ignored. Witnesses were recalled, their statements cross-examined with precision. The defense attorney asked questions specifically to probe discrepancies that Emma's observation had suggested. "Can you confirm the position of the individual at the time the police arrived?" he inquired. Hesitation followed, subtle but telling. The officers who had initially interpreted movements one way now found themselves reconsidering. The dog's subtle gestures, paw shifts, sniffing patterns, head tilts were correlated with Emma's focus and small gestures. The courtroom, once static and predictable, was alive with recalibration, each adult aware that a toddler's 2 words had catalyzed an unprecedented review. Mark and Lily observed quietly, their hearts pounding. Every step the investigators took, every question the lawyers asked, seemed to validate Emma's instinctive observation. They whispered to each other, she might actually be right. Yet, even as adults re-evaluated, Emma remained blissfully unaware of her role. She followed the dog's movements, noticed the slight hesitation in the defendant's responses, and clutched her teddy with quiet concentration. She had pointed, spoken, and observed, and now, without knowing it, her actions were unraveling layers of misinterpretation and false assumptions, built over weeks of investigation. The prosecution adjusted as well, calling witnesses back to verify details under the renewed scrutiny. Statements were checked against photographs, videos, and evidence that had previously seemed conclusive. The narrative began to fracture. Minor inconsistencies grew into significant questions about who had committed the crime. Every adult in the courtroom felt the subtle tremor caused by Emma's observation. What they had accepted as truth was no longer unquestionable. The dog, sensitive to changes in scent and movement, aligned its behavior with a new line of questioning, reinforcing the evolving perspective. By mid-afternoon, the ripple effect of Emma's observation was undeniable. Officers consulted with forensic analysts, reviewing new findings with cautious optimism. The defense attorney suggested re-evaluating assumptions about the suspects, movements, and potential opportunities to commit the crime. Witnesses' credibility, once taken for granted, was questioned more rigorously. Even the judge, experienced and steadfast, acknowledged the weight of reconsidering evidence in light of unexpected insight. Emma's presence had quietly transformed the courtroom dynamic. Adults, trained in law, procedure, and evidence, were now guided, subtly but decisively, by the perceptive instincts of a 3-year-old. The dog remained calm but attentive, reacting subtly to the shifts in behavior of those in the courtroom. Emma's small gestures, slight nods, finger points, murmured observations, drew the attention of her parents and indirectly the professionals. Each piece of evidence was re-evaluated and each statement reconsidered. Patterns that had been missed in prior reviews became glaringly obvious under the new scrutiny. Emma's intuitive clarity, combined with the dog's responses, created a synergy that adults could not ignore. The simple statement, "Not him," had ignited a meticulous, methodical revisitation of the case, and what seemed trivial now carried monumental implications. As the afternoon session drew to a close, the investigators summarized their findings. Misplaced evidence, overlooked footprints, and subtle inconsistencies in timelines were documented. Emma's role, though unspoken, was central. Her attention to the dog and the environment had highlighted gaps in perception that no adult had noticed. The courtroom hummed with anticipation, lawyers murmuring over new angles, officers exchanging nods of realization. Emma, clutching her teddy and gazing intently at the dog, remained a quiet observer. The smallest voice in the room had begun to shape the truth, setting the stage for revelations that would soon challenge everyone's understanding of the case. The courtroom was alive with quiet tension as the afternoon session began. Emma remained perched on her mother's lap, her tiny fingers clutching the fraying ear of her teddy bear. She had observed everything: the defendant's nervous shifts, the dog's subtle reactions, and the inconsistencies in statements that adults had overlooked. Though she could not yet articulate the full weight of her understanding, her instinctive clarity had already begun to influence every action in the room. Lawyers whispered, officers consulted, and the judge, though maintaining composure, exhibited a subtle crease of concentration between his brows. The trial's trajectory was shifting, and it all began with the 3-year-old's unwavering attention. Detectives and forensic specialists had been quietly re-examining evidence during the recess, their eyes tracing every detail previously assumed resolved. Photographs were scrutinized anew, fingerprints reassessed, and footprints compared with meticulous care. The defense attorney, with a calm but knowing smile, suggested new lines of inquiry, highlighting discrepancies that Emma's 2 words had brought to light. "Your Honor," he said, leaning forward slightly, "we now have reason to reconsider the original assumptions of the case. The evidence, when seen in conjunction with certain observations, indicates that the suspect may not be the person initially accused." The judge paused, scanning the room with a measured gaze. Emma's attention was riveted on the police dog. Its nose twitched as it sniffed the courtroom floor, its ears tilted slightly in response to movements and scents. Emma leaned closer to her teddy, whispering, "See? See?" Her small voice, soft yet filled with certainty, captured the subtle dynamics that adults struggled to quantify. The dog's behavior mirrored her own perception, reinforcing the notion that the chain of events might be different from what had been previously believed. Officers quietly exchanged glances, each recognizing that the combination of a child's observation and the dog's instincts offered insights that were difficult to dismiss. Witnesses were recalled, their testimonies now carefully measured against the inconsistencies uncovered in the renewed examination. Questions were precise, almost surgical, aimed at clarifying details once overlooked. "Can you describe exactly where the individual was standing when you saw them?" asked the defense attorney, voice calm but firm. Hesitation followed, subtle but telling. The officers had already noted these inconsistencies in their private review, and now, under the pressure of scrutiny, the witnesses' recollections faltered. Emma's observation pointing at the dog and murmuring, "Not him," was guiding the adults to consider scenarios they had previously disregarded. Mark and Lily watched, their hearts racing as the courtroom slowly adjusted to the new reality. Their daughter, unaware of the legal storm she had set in motion, simply observed, her eyes wide and alert. She noticed the minute changes in the dog's posture, a paw lift here, a subtle shift of the head there. To Emma, These were unmistakable signs that something important was being revealed. Each small gesture of the dog reinforced what she had already intuited. The real perpetrator's actions had left subtle, almost invisible clues, and the adults were finally beginning to recognize them. The judge called the next witness, a police officer who had initially helped collect evidence at the crime scene. "Please recount your observations during the investigation," the judge instructed. The officer hesitated slightly, glancing toward the dog and then the child. For the first time, he spoke with a tone that reflected both doubt and realization. "At the scene, I may have misinterpreted certain movements," he admitted quietly. "Some evidence, initially thought to point to the defendant, may have been misleading." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Emma, sensing the shift, leaned slightly forward, her eyes fixed on the dog, whispering softly to her Teddy. Yes. The prosecution, sensing the fragility of their case, attempted to regain control, questioning the officer further. Yet even under cross-examination, the inconsistencies were undeniable. A misplaced glove, a faint footprint on a windowsill, the position of furniture, it all suggested a sequence of events that did not align with the original narrative. Emma's insight, expressed through her attention to the dog and her tiny gestures, had exposed flaws in assumptions that professionals had taken for granted. Each revelation built upon the last, forming a growing tapestry of truth that the courtroom could no longer ignore. The defense attorney seized the opportunity. "Your Honor, it appears that the evidence now points elsewhere. We request that the focus be reconsidered, taking into account the observations of all present, including those made by the child." The judge, after a brief pause, nodded. "Proceed carefully," he instructed, and the courtroom returned to examination of the details, this time with heightened awareness. Emma's tiny hands clutched her Teddy with quiet determination. She did not yet understand the adult language of justice, but she sensed the momentum had shifted, that her observation, small and simple as it was unraveling misconceptions and revealing the real sequence of events. The police dog, trained to detect traces imperceptible to human senses, became an unspoken ally in this process. It sniffed and shifted subtly, alerting officers to faint evidence overlooked before. Emma's gestures aligned with these cues. A point here, a quiet whisper there. Adults who had once dismissed the child's comments now found themselves consulting the dog's responses, realizing that intuition and instinct, though unconventional, were guiding them to truth. The courtroom's tension heightened, a mix of curiosity, disbelief, and anticipation filling the air. Witnesses began to reveal inconsistencies more clearly under the renewed scrutiny. A neighbor, initially adamant about the defendant's movements, hesitated and then admitted uncertainty. A security camera previously overlooked was re-examined, revealing shadows and movements inconsistent with the initial account. Each piece of evidence, when viewed in the light of Emma's observations and the dog's responses, painted a picture far different from what adults had assumed. Emma remained calm, her gaze unwavering, absorbing the subtle shifts and patterns. Her tiny mind processing connections adults were only beginning to see by mid-afternoon. The courtroom atmosphere had transformed entirely. The ripple of doubt that Emma had initiated expanded into a wave of reconsideration. The officers quietly consulted one another. The defense attorney sharpened his line of questioning, and even the prosecution acknowledged the weight of the new perspective. The judge, though maintaining authority, displayed a rare look of contemplation. Emma's 2 words had triggered a meticulous reassessment of events, challenging assumptions and revealing hidden truths. The dog, ever vigilant, continued to react subtly to the real cues, reinforcing the growing realization that the true story had yet to be fully told. Mark and Lily exchanged a glance filled with awe. Their daughter, small and seemingly powerless, had become the catalyst for uncovering the truth. Emma, oblivious to her monumental influence, whispered occasionally to her teddy, murmuring observations about movements, positions, and gestures. Adults, now guided by a combination of instinct and analysis, began connecting the dots that Emma's quiet perception had highlighted. The courtroom, once a rigid structure of procedure and assumption, was alive with revelation. A child's intuition and a police dog's instincts were leading the way to uncover the actual events of the burglary. As the afternoon drew to a close, the judge called a brief recess. Lawyers conferred, officers quietly reviewed evidence, and the jury absorbed the subtle shifts in proceedings. Emma remained focused on the dog, her tiny hand occasionally pointing, whispering quietly to her teddy. Each gesture, though almost imperceptible, was a signal and unspoken guide that helped adults see what had been missed. The trial had evolved into a delicate dance of observation and instinct, where the combined perception of a child and a trained animal revealed what years of procedure alone could not. By the end of the day, the stage was set. The cracks in the original narrative had become undeniable. Emma's insight, expressed through small gestures and whispered words, had forced a re-evaluation of evidence and testimony. The dog's behavior corroborated her observations, creating a synergy of intuition that adults could neither explain nor ignore. The courtroom, once dominated by rigid assumptions and procedure, now vibrated with anticipation. The truth, obscured by earlier errors, was beginning to emerge, and Emma, unaware of the magnitude of her role, had become the quiet architect of revelation. The courtroom fell into a tense hush as the trial resumed after the brief recess. Emma remained seated on her mother's lap, clutching her teddy, her eyes fixed on the police dog. Every subtle movement of the animal, every twitch of its ears or paw, seemed to communicate what adults could not yet articulate. The renewed scrutiny of evidence and witness testimony had begun to fracture the initial narrative of the burglary. The tension was almost palpable. Everyone present sensed that the course of the trial was about to shift dramatically. The defense attorney, leaning slightly toward the judge, spoke with calm determination. "Your Honor, based on the observations of all present and the inconsistencies revealed in our renewed examination of evidence, we believe it is appropriate to reassess the case with a focus on the actual sequence of events rather than assumptions." The judge nodded, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes attentive. He gestured for the courtroom to proceed. Witnesses returned to the stand, their statements now scrutinized through the dual lens of human testimony and the subtle cues observed by Emma. And the police dog? Emma's attention never wavered. She noticed a slight hesitation in the defendant's posture, a fleeting glance toward a previously overlooked door, and the careful positioning of objects near the crime scene photographs displayed in court. Her tiny finger twitched, pointing subtly toward the dog. "There," she whispered to her teddy. "Look there." Mark and Lily glanced at each other in disbelief. Their daughter, with no understanding of legal procedure, had identified a detail that adults had overlooked, yet it aligned perfectly with the dog's instincts. The animal's subtle but consistent attention toward a small stack of papers near the defense table confirmed what Emma had silently perceived. The head detective, seated near the evidence, approached the judge with quiet urgency. "Your Honor," he said, voice low but firm, "we've reanalyzed the evidence in light of the child's observations and the dog's responses. There are significant discrepancies between what we initially believed and what the evidence now indicates." The judge, leaning slightly forward, acknowledged the statement with a nod. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Witnesses, lawyers, and jurors alike realized that the established assumptions were unraveling, their certainties replaced by a growing awareness of an alternative narrative, one that Emma had unwittingly illuminated. The first witness recalled the precise moment of the burglary, describing the suspect's movements with increased scrutiny. Hesitation crept into the testimony. I think I may have misremembered the angle, the witness admitted, eyes flicking toward the police dog, and then to Emma. The child's tiny gesture pointing toward the dog and whispering, "Not him," resonated silently across the room. Officers consulted quietly, re-examining timelines and footprints that had initially seemed conclusive. Patterns emerged that had been invisible before. The pieces of the puzzle slowly began to align, revealing a path the original investigation had missed entirely. Emma's tiny observations now served as a subtle compass. She pointed again, this time toward a minor smudge on a set of documents near the evidence table. Her voice, soft but insistent, said, "See? There." The dog, responding to the faint scent trail, leaned slightly forward, alert and attentive. Adults noticed the alignment, their attention shifting as they correlated Emma's gesture with the dog's trained instincts. What had seemed trivial, a toddler pointing, an animal reacting, suddenly took on monumental significance. The evidence was being viewed through an unprecedented lens, the combined perception of a child and a trained police dog. The defense attorney seized the opportunity. "Your Honor, if we examine these newly highlighted areas and the discrepancies between initial witness statements, it becomes apparent that the defendant may not have been the individual responsible." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor, now visibly unsettled, attempted to counter, but even the most persuasive arguments could not obscure the tangible contradictions emerging. Evidence, timelines, and observations aligned increasingly with Emma's initial perception. The courtroom, once dominated by rigid certainty, now operated under a fragile equilibrium where the smallest details held tremendous sway. Emma, aware only of her focus and the dog's subtle movements, continued to observe. She noticed a slight shift in the defendant's demeanor, the way he avoided the gaze of officers, and the almost imperceptible pattern in which items had been moved at the crime scene. Her finger twitched, pointing toward the source of the inconsistencies. "There," she whispered again, almost reverently. The judge, lawyers, and investigators watched closely as the dog subtly responded, confirming Emma's observation. What had started as an innocent act of pointing was now a pivotal element in uncovering the truth. Turning point came when the police dog, guided by both instinct and Emma's silent cues, reacted decisively toward a location near a previously ignored window. Officers examined the area carefully and discovered evidence that had been missed in the original investigation: a glove with traces of the perpetrator's fingerprints, a footprint that did not match the defendant, and a faint trail of fibers leading away from the scene. Emma's eyes widened. She had noticed the correlation before any adult had, and her instinctive observation had directly guided the discovery. The courtroom collectively recognized that the previous assumptions had been flawed. Witnesses, upon re-examination, corroborated the new findings. A neighbor, initially confident in the identification of the suspect, now admitted uncertainty. I didn't see clearly," they confessed, glancing nervously at the dog, and then Emma. Officers, lawyers, and the judge absorbed the unfolding revelations with a mixture of awe and professional scrutiny. The courtroom had transformed. What had begun as a procedural trial had evolved into a meticulous reconstruction of events, guided not by preconceived notions, but by the perceptive observations of a small child and the instincts of a police dog. Emma's quiet participation had fundamentally altered the trial. Adults relied on her pointing and whispered words to validate emerging hypotheses. She noticed every subtle change that tilted the dog's head, a hesitant glance from a witness, the misalignment of a piece of evidence, and instinctively highlighted them. The defense attorney skillfully incorporated these insights into his arguments, and the prosecutor struggled to maintain a coherent narrative in light of mounting inconsistencies. The courtroom was tense, alive with anticipation. As the truth began to emerge in full clarity, the final revelation came when the evidence, cross-referenced with witness statements and the dog's reactions, pointed unmistakably to a different individual, entirely a neighbor with access to the property, opportunity, and motive. The defense attorney stood, presenting the compiled findings to the judge and jury. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady but charged with significance. "The cumulative observations, including those made by the child and corroborated by the police dog, indicate that the defendant before you is not responsible for this crime." The courtroom was silent, every person present absorbing the magnitude of the statement. Emma, small and unassuming, remained focused on the dog, her finger occasionally twitching in quiet acknowledgement. The judge, after reviewing the compiled evidence and hearing arguments, addressed the courtroom. "It appears that the original narrative has been critically reconsidered. New evidence and observations indicate that the defendant may not have committed the crime as previously believed. Further investigation will confirm these findings, but the implications are clear." A collective exhale swept through the room. Mark and Lily hugged their daughter, whispering words of praise. Emma, unaware of the legal magnitude of her actions, simply hugged her teddy, satisfied with the alignment of the dog's subtle cues and her own observations. The courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary. A 3-year-old's innocent observation, combined with a trained police dog's instincts, had unveiled the true sequence of events and revealed the real perpetrator's actions. The trial, once predictable and procedural, had transformed into a testament to intuition, observation, and the unexpected power of perception. Witnesses, officers, lawyers, and the judge all recognized the significance of the moment. Emma's 2 words, "Not him," had not only disrupted the assumptions of adults, but had directly guided the path to uncovering the truth. As the session adjourned for the day, reporters whispered excitedly, eager to capture the story of a child whose perception had changed the outcome of a legal proceeding. Jurors, officers, and attorneys discussed the remarkable events quietly, still processing the unusual chain of events. Emma, small and unassuming, remained a silent witness to the culmination of her instinctive observations. The courtroom, a space of law and procedure, had become a theater of revelation, orchestrated by innocence, attention to detail, and an unexpected alliance between a child and a dog. By the end of the day, the courtroom's atmosphere had shifted entirely. Doubt had replaced certainty, assumptions had been overturned, and the real culprit was clearly identified. Emma's intuition, manifested through a simple gesture and 2 words, had guided professionals to uncover what adults alone could not see. The trial's trajectory had been irrevocably altered, and the impact of a perceptive child's insight would be remembered long after the legal PR. The courtroom was still thick with tension as the final session began. Emma sat on her mother's lap, clutching her teddy bear, eyes wide and attentive. Though she did not fully understand the complexities of the trial, she sensed that the outcome depended on the observations she had made. Subtle gestures, whispered words, and the silent guidance of the police dog. Adults moved with purpose, cross-checking evidence, revisiting statements, and confirming the findings that had gradually shifted the narrative from one of certainty to one of revelation. Emma's 2 words, "Not him," had grown into a catalyst that exposed the truth. The defense attorney, standing with careful precision, summarized the new understanding of the events. "Your Honor, based on the combined observations of witnesses, detectives, and notably the perceptive guidance of a young child, it has become evident that the defendant before you is not responsible for this crime. The evidence, when correctly interpreted, points to a different individual entirely." The judge, an experienced man accustomed to procedural decorum, leaned forward, absorbing the words with deliberate attention. For the first time in the trial, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Justice, it seemed, was ready to be realigned with truth. Detectives and officers moved efficiently, presenting the reanalyzed evidence that confirmed the new findings. Fingerprints, footprints, and subtle traces of movement aligned with the emerging picture. A neighbor, previously overlooked, had taken advantage of the chaos to commit the burglary. The defendant, initially accused based on circumstantial evidence and misinterpretations, was now clearly innocent. Emma, still small and seated quietly, instinctively observed the shifts in behavior, the subtle adjustments in stance, and the faint expressions of relief from her parents. Her intuitive perception, innocent yet precise, had guided a courtroom full of adults toward clarity. Witnesses returned to the stand, corroborating the revised account. One by one, they acknowledged uncertainties, corrected previous misstatements, and confirmed timelines that aligned with the new evidence. The police dog, trained to detect nuanced scents and hidden details, responded subtly but unmistakably to each piece of evidence connected to the real perpetrator. Emma, watching intently, occasionally whispered to her teddy, "Yes, that's right." Her tiny gestures had become a compass for adults, highlighting inconsistencies and guiding professional judgment in ways no one had anticipated. The judge called for a final review of the evidence. Lawyers meticulously laid out the sequence of events, the initial misinterpretations, the overlooked clues, the minor discrepancies in witness testimony, and most importantly, the alignment of Emma's observations with the dog's responses. "It is clear," the judge said, his voice steady, "that the original assumptions regarding the defendant's involvement were incorrect. Further investigation confirms that the actual perpetrator is another individual who had access and opportunity consistent with the evidence now presented." The courtroom was silent, the words heavy with implication. Mark and Lily exchanged glances, a mixture of awe and relief washing over them. Their daughter, unaware of the legal significance, sat quietly, eyes flicking between the dog and the evidence, absorbing the flow of events. The realization that Emma's perception had directly contributed to uncovering the truth filled them with pride. They whispered softly, "You did it, honey," though Emma, clutching her teddy, only nodded slightly, sensing satisfaction, but not fully comprehending the monumental impact of her actions. The defense attorney turned toward the jury, summarizing the implications of the revised evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, the individual originally accused has been proven innocent. The true perpetrator, as revealed through careful observation, evidence review, and the unique insights of a perceptive child, is now clearly identifiable. I urge you to consider the evidence and observations in their entirety, for justice must reflect truth, not assumption." The jury, attentive and focused, absorbed the testimony and visual evidence with heightened awareness. The courtroom had become a space where careful observation, both human and instinctive, had overturned previous certainties. The police dog, its training impeccable, guided officers to the location of additional supporting evidence connected to the real perpetrator. A glove, partially concealed and previously unnoticed, contained fingerprints that matched the neighbor now identified as responsible. Footprints and fibers reinforced the timeline established through testimony and observation. Emma's quiet pointing and murmurs had led adults to consider details that would otherwise have been disregarded. The courtroom seemed to breathe collectively, the weight of impending justice settling into a tangible relief. The prosecutor, finally recognizing the strength of the evidence and the clarity of the new narrative, spoke cautiously. "Your Honor, based on the findings presented, it is evident that the defendant has no connection to the crime. We accept the revised conclusions and support the continued investigation into the actual perpetrator." A subtle murmur of acknowledgement passed through the courtroom. The defense attorney smiled gently at Emma, who, in her innocent way, had become the catalyst for this revelation. Adults, trained to rely on logic and procedure, had been guided to truth by intuition, perception, and an unassuming child. The judge, addressing the courtroom with measured authority, outlined the conclusion of the trial proceedings. Based on the evidence, the defendant before us is hereby cleared of all charges. The investigation will continue regarding the individual now identified as responsible. The court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances that led to the discovery of the truth, including the observations made by the young child present today. A quiet, respectful applause arose from the courtroom. Emma's parents embraced her tightly, whispering words of praise and gratitude. Their small daughter had, in her own way, restored justice through clarity and perception. Media personnel, now permitted to enter for a controlled briefing, documented the unprecedented events. Reporters, cameras, and microphones captured the story of a 3-year-old whose keen observation had shifted the outcome of a trial. Articles would later describe the child's perceptiveness, the dog's subtle guidance, and the remarkable collaboration of intuition and evidence. Emma, seated quietly with her teddy, was unaware of the magnitude of the attention she would receive. To her, it had been a matter of watching closely, noticing patterns, and pointing out inconsistencies. Outside the courtroom, the community reacted with astonishment. Neighbors, friends, and local residents marveled at the story of a toddler whose perception had corrected a miscarriage of justice. Conversations in homes, cafes, and public spaces centered on the unique role Emma had played. Her combination of innocence and observation became a symbol of clarity in a complex system. Even seasoned investigators reflected on the experience, recognizing that sometimes the most unexpected perspectives, those of a small child or a perceptive animal, could reveal truths that adults, constrained by procedure and assumption, might miss. As the day concluded, Mark and Lily walked hand in hand with Emma, marveling at the extraordinary turn of events. The police dog trotted faithfully alongside, silent yet vigilant, its subtle cues throughout the trial having aligned perfectly with Emma's observations. The family paused outside the courthouse steps, basking in relief and pride. Emma's contributions, though simple in action, pointing, whispering, and observing, had led to the restoration of justice. The child's innocence, combined with her perceptive mind, had become the quiet but decisive force that had revealed the truth, ensuring that the right person would be held accountable. The trial, once mired in assumptions and misinterpretations, ended with clarity and restored confidence in the judicial process. Emma's tiny voice, whispered words, and keen attention had left an indelible mark. Adults, jurors, officers, and legal professionals would long remember the day a 3-year-old toddler and a trained police dog together changed the outcome of a courtroom, proving that truth often lies in details that only the observant can perceive. The story became a testament to intuition, observation, and the extraordinary impact of the smallest voices. As the family left the courthouse, reporters and officials acknowledged Emma's unique role. Her parents held her close, whispering congratulations, while the dog remained a silent companion, its instincts validated by the outcome. Emma, blissfully unaware of fame or recognition, simply hugged her teddy, satisfied with the alignment of events she had noticed and the calm resolution that followed. Justice had been served, the innocent cleared, and the true culprit identified, all because a child noticed what others could not, proving that sometimes the smallest observer can have the largest impact.